Hi, can you guys all hear me? That's... So, okay, so I'll just jump right into it. It's really nice to be with you guys today. My talk today is going to be building on an ongoing conversation about university rankings in Singapore, or in other words, our climbing of certain peaks of excellence, and how this contributes to certain kinds of research being undervalued. And that's a topic that a few of the editors of AcademiaSG have written publicly about on multiple occasions. And so my goal today is really just to bring my personal experience to bear on this issue. One, to provide further evidence that these processes are at work, and two, to give a bit more concrete thought to what specific types of knowledge we might be underproducing. So before I start, I just want to clarify that I'm speaking from a specific position because these positions very much shape the kinds of experiences that I'll be talking about. So who am I? First, I'm a sociologist who is mostly focused on Singapore in my research and who's also studying at an American university. And I also recently had an experience looking for academic jobs in Singapore and Hong Kong. And so at various points along the way, I've been asked these questions such as, what is your strategy for getting research on Singapore published in well-ranked journals? For your dissertation, maybe you can consider doing a comparison of Singapore and the US. And what lessons does the Singapore case have for audiences elsewhere? And so the message that I get from these questions is that it's not enough to study Singapore in isolation, and that Singapore is interesting really only as a case for revealing general processes that may apply elsewhere. And so this reflects the first of two structural conditions I want to talk about that shapes the kind of research that I produce, which is that there's a global status hierarchy in my discipline. So for example, there are these things called journal rankings, as you might know, and the highest ranking journals are located most often in the US, at least in my discipline. And so if we want to make Singapore relevant to sociologists in the US, we often have to take the West as our reference category in our writing. The second structural condition is that our universities participate in this hierarchy, right? So we're anxious about climbing this hierarchy and maintaining our place in it. And you guys are very familiar with these sorts of headlines. We take a lot of pride in our universities being so-called leading universities according to these global rankings. And that then imposes a kind of discipline on academics who feel pressured to publish in good journals. And so this might be the reason why when I talked to a future colleague at SMU a few months ago, she advised me to try and make sure that I was framing my work for an international audience and to make sure that I'm trying to publish in Q1 journals. And that's just a reference to the first quartile of the journal rankings, which interestingly was like a brand new term to me. I hadn't heard of it before. And so these two conditions here then shape the kinds of research that get valued and therefore what kinds of research get conducted. And I'm of course not the first one to make this observation. So Yo Yen has a book chapter on doing public sociology in Singapore. And here she's writing about how because of these structures that I've just been talking about, it may not be strategic for junior faculty to focus on certain types of scholarship. For example, scholarship that may not have theoretical payoffs, but that add important descriptive detail to understandings of a case. These are not rational priorities for junior faculty trying to hold on to jobs. And then Yasmin Ortega, who's a sociologist at SMU, she recently published a study with her co-authors where they interviewed Singaporean academics at local universities who had been trained overseas. And some of their interviewees shared that, and I'm quoting here, for their universities, publishing in a prestigious venue seemed more important than doing work that had local relevance. And so they felt they had to prioritize topics that were enticing enough for a global academic audience. This push to pursue big questions implied that Singapore-focused studies did not contribute to general academic scholarship. And so these accounts then suggest that we might have a problem of undone science. And this term undone science is one that I'm borrowing from the sociology of knowledge. Specifically, it comes from studies of how certain kinds of environmental research don't get conducted, even though they are essential for protecting public health, often because they're counter to powerful interests such as industry. And so the empirical context is a bit different, but we can still use the term to refer in an abstract sense to knowledge that would be useful from a public interest perspective, but that's systematically underproduced because of certain structural conditions that shape knowledge production. And so what does this undone science look like exactly? I'm going to talk about two kinds of undone science that I see, and I'm going to draw from my own experience of working on my dissertation, which is focused on how parents in Singapore choose primary schools. So both of these kinds of research are what social scientists would call descriptive research. And this is research that describes the empirical details of an issue within a particular setting, as opposed to research that makes a theoretical argument about how a general process works across contexts. And sociologists in the US, they do regularly conduct this kind of research, and they do manage to get it published in top journals. But someone who studies Singapore would face more of a challenge getting descriptive research published because it's just less likely to offer anything theoretically novel for US-based audiences. So the first kind of undone science is what we might call stylized facts. This is not my term. There's a sociologist at my university, Dan Hirschman, who's recently done a lot of work to help us understand what stylized facts are and what function they perform in social science. So in his words, stylized facts are the regularities that social scientists build theories and models in order to explain. And so these are statistical observations of the social world that analysts would generate from raw data. So they might be trends across time, or frequencies, or simple associations. And an example of a stylized fact in the US is that the top 1% of income earners receive 15% of all income. And a recent example in Singapore would be that our total fertility rate fell to 0.97 in 2023, which you might have heard like many, many times by now. And so these stylized facts, they play a key role in social science because they identify phenomena that are important to study, and they're basically the outcomes that we as a research community form around. So they're the things that we try to explain as social scientists. But in my experience of conducting my dissertation, I've found that there's a lack of robust stylized facts on the topics that I study. So I mentioned that my dissertation is a study of how parents choose primary schools in Singapore. And the reason I'm interested in this is because this is a process that affects how different students from different backgrounds sort into different schools, right? So of course, I would like to be able to contextualize my work by citing some basic research about questions, for example, how segregated are our schools, whether socioeconomically or racially, and how much inequality is there between schools of different demographic profiles, for example, in terms of their academic performance, or maybe in Singapore, if we're interested in other metrics beyond grades, we might measure inequality in other ways as well. And as I mentioned, this kind of descriptive work is done by sociologists studying the US, and it gets published in good journals. So this piece, for example, was published in the American Journal of Sociology, which is one of the highest status journals in the discipline. And so what the authors do here is they take nationwide data on standardized test scores, and they calculate the inequality along racial ethnic lines at the local level. So the authors themselves call this a descriptive study. The value of it is really just in giving people the lay of the land, and then it's up to other scholars to develop and test theories about what is going on here. But descriptive research like that about Singapore would probably be hard to get published in highly ranked journals. And in the absence of research like that, what we have instead are ad hoc and truly stylized facts from the government, right? So for example, we have this statistic from Ong Yi Kang in 2018, where he says, over 80% of our schools have a relatively good mix of students, with at least 5% of their students from the top and bottom socioeconomic quintiles. But I find that this number is quite hard to interpret without additional context. So for example, how do we know that this is a relatively good mix? Because if you think about it, if we have completely proportional representation of students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, then we would in fact have 20% of students from each of the top and bottom socioeconomic quintiles, right? So who's to say that 5% is enough to have a relatively good mix? And then maybe more importantly, how has this 80% number been changing over time? So I'm just trying to suggests here that we really don't have a systematic understanding of the demographic makeup of our schools. And so stylized facts are the first type of undone science. And as I mentioned, they're descriptions of the kinds of outcomes that we care about. And so in addition to that, we also need research on the processes that contribute to these outcomes. And I don't have a nice pithy term like stylized facts here to refer to this kind of work. So I'm just going to call them descriptions of processes for now. And so this is an example from the US of the kind of research that I'm talking about. It was published in Sociology of Education, which is the top journal in the subfield. And it highlights a specific aspect of the school registration process in Boston that disadvantages certain families. So basically, the school districts in Boston, they have something like an early admissions process. So there's a priority deadline and then there's a regular deadline. And the study just finds that white families are much more likely to register by the priority deadline and fill up most of the spots in popular schools, which sounds kind of similar to what we have in Singapore, right? So this is what we would call a descriptive piece of research, where it's not trying to make a special theoretical contribution, but it's still valuable because it tells us something important about a process that contributes to school segregation in Boston. And so we might imagine asking similar kinds of questions about the P1 registration process. In Singapore, for example, we might ask, what do different parents do to get into schools of their choice? For example, do they move or volunteer, or maybe they have their kids commute to school? Maybe they do none of these things. How do different parents gather information about schools? How do different parents end up living where they're living and therefore end up with the kinds of school choices available to them? And I haven't come across studies that specifically answer these questions within the Singapore context. But despite that lack of research, I also was not drawn to answering these kinds of questions in my dissertation. Why? Well, that's because these are all questions that have been studied already in Western contexts and published in journals like Social Ed. And so asking the same questions in Singapore is not very likely to lead us to novel theoretical findings, right? So essentially, I find myself in this incentive structure that makes me constantly ask what is new about my research. And literally, like, this is a question that keeps me up at night and causes a lot of anxiety for me. Of course, the hidden subtitle in this question is what is new specifically to an audience of US-based sociologists, and especially what's new in terms of theory. And the reason this is anxiety-inducing for me is because ultimately my career prospects hang on my being able to make a claim to novelty in front of these audiences that I'm told matter and about the things that they find so-called interesting, right? And in the end, I miss an opportunity to conduct the kind of basic descriptive research on the types of questions that I talked about on the previous slide. So in the absence of systematic research about these processes contributing to school segregation, what we have instead are these occasional media reports about the things that kiasu parents do to get their kids into popular schools. And kiasu parenting is highly visible, and so it's everybody's favorite scapegoat, but we don't actually know if this is the main reason why we have different demographic makeups in different schools, right? So it could, for example, be more of an issue of residential sorting, so different families end up living in different areas for reasons that are unrelated to school quality. And in that case, like maybe we just shouldn't focus so much of our attention on the P1 registration process per se. So to wrap up here, like I mentioned, I focus quite a bit on my personal experience in this talk, but to the extent that other people have similar experiences, then we may have a larger problem of undone science in Singaporean scholarship. And so this just makes me ask, what is the value of participating in this global academic status hierarchy exactly? Because the way I see it, it seems like we certainly might be doing this at a cost, which is that we may be underproducing the kinds of basic and descriptive, but nonetheless necessary research for understanding the social issues that we care about. And why does this issue matter? Well, at the most basic level, like I've been saying, it just means we may lack a systematic understanding of some of the issues that we care about, especially the issues that are more sensitive to talk about. And in the absence of this, we have other powerful knowledge producers who have a monopoly on shaping our understanding of these issues. But beyond that, it also means we might not be deploying our intellectual resources very efficiently, because if each of us is speaking to audiences in our respective disciplinary homes and we're not talking to one another, then that might mean that our knowledge production process is not cumulative. So we're not building on one another's work as much as we could. And then finally, I also think that by prioritizing Western audiences, we might end up having an extractive relationship with our research subjects, in which we take their time and we take their stories and we turn them into these theoretical arguments that our Western audiences may or may not find interesting. And by the end of it, we're left with little bandwidth for framing and communicating our findings for local publics and policymakers. I'm going to end here. I have a few questions that I could pose in the Q&A, but I'm out of time, and I should give you guys a chance to ask questions too. So thanks so much for your attention. And yeah, here's my contact info.
So thank you, Jacqueline and Yimeng. You please stick around. We will come back to you during the Q&A. So in 2021, AcademiaSG published a survey on restrictions that academics in Singaporean universities face in their research, teaching, and their public outreach. Although there's no previous research to compare with, anecdotally, the situation seems to have gotten worse over the past decade or two. We regularly hear of universities' intentions to hire or retain faculty being blocked by an opaque political vetting system. Academics often require permission from their supervisors before inviting guest speakers and before reaching out to the public through civil society and the media. The net effect has been to keep most academics in splendid isolation within the ivory tower. This is the norm that my friends and I at AcademiaSG have been trying to challenge in our work, and it's a major reason why we're doing this conference, to declare publicly and unapologetically that academics are part of broader societal conversations that are impoverished if we do not cross the artificial boundaries between disciplines, between theory and practice, and between modes of knowledge production. Academics' contributions to discussions are not necessarily more relevant or profound than anyone else's, but academics are uniquely positioned to link current issues to other non-obvious wellsprings of knowledge, simply because that's our day job. We're paid, usually at public expense, to do what most other citizens struggle to find time for. However, Singaporean academics are conspicuous by their absence in various public discussions. In most other societies that are higher education hubs, even small ones like Hong Kong, the Netherlands, New Zealand, academics and their universities play prominent roles in complex domestic debates, applying their expertise to offer research-based evidence and counterintuitive insights. What about here in Singapore? In my own field of media politics, Singapore recently underwent the biggest structural change in professional news media for 5 decades. It is now the only developed non-communist country in the world with no major commercial daily news organizations, where virtually all professional daily reporting for a local audience is funded by the government with no guarantee of editorial independence. If Singapore were a normal country, media and communication departments at NTU at NUS would be organizing panel discussions and publishing edited volumes about these huge developments. Individual faculty members would be writing papers analyzing these changes. But no, they've been absent in public discussions and in academic conferences. Then there's history. For many years, Singaporeans have shown themselves ready to reflect on the early years of nation building. We're not satisfied with an official history that does not honestly account for the human and environmental costs of Singapore's surge to first world standards of living. And yes, there are historians who have helped us in this quest for self-understanding. But these historians seem to operate exclusively outside of the history departments of NUS and NTU, neither of which seem to feel any shame that the one institution that we can't count on for expertise on the history of modern Singapore is the history department of a modern Singapore university. I suspect the situation is better in geography, sociology, maybe law, but relatively bad in political science and economics. So it does vary a bit by discipline. Overall, though, it's not an exaggeration to say that Singaporeans' return on investment in higher education is poor relative to global industry norms. That is, if we expect universities not only to churn out future-ready, employable graduates and monetizable research outputs, but also to play an active role in the country's public life. The political conditions that have led to this state of affairs have been well documented in AcademiaSG reports. But like Jacqueline, I'd like to focus on the seemingly non-political internal structure of incentives and disincentives that influences what is or isn't researched and taught in our universities. For the uninitiated, I'll try to explain the system as clearly as possible. But I have to warn you that even after I explain it, it may seem incomprehensible. But I want to assure you that the fault is not yours, it's ours. There are genuinely bizarre aspects of how academia governs itself. Let's be clear about one thing. If academics are drawing a salary, their performance must be subject to regular, rational, transparent assessment. But that does not make any assessment system okay. There are better and worse ways of doing it. I know these systems better than I'd ever intended to. Having over the past 20 years in academia served as a department head and associate dean for research, a member of Hong Kong University Grants Committee Specialist Panel for Social Sciences, an external reviewer for promotion and tenure cases in various universities and so on. In carrying out these roles, I developed some sense of best practices, but unfortunately also of worst practices in how academics are assessed. Modern scholarship is built on the principle of independent peer review, which requires knowledgeable experts to read what you write critically and thus assess its originality, its significance, its contribution to knowledge, and so on. That's the gold standard for assessment, but it's costly and time-consuming. So when assessing large numbers of faculty, university administrators around the world have increasingly relied on shortcuts. Citations, how many times your work has been quoted by others, is one possible measure, but citations take years to build up, so they're of limited value for annual appraisals, as well as for assessing new scholars who've just come out with a PhD and haven't had time to build up citations. So the quickest proxy measure, in lieu of reading research outputs directly, is to eyeball where one's work has been published. If the journal or book publisher is regarded as excellent, the bean counters are prepared to conclude that anything published in it must be excellent too, without reading a word. Conversely, if research is published by what we're told is a second-tier or third-tier journal or publisher, there's no need to read that either. It must be a second-tier or third-tier piece of research, just based on the brand reputation of the book or journal. Aside from ease of implementation, another reason why such assessment systems have proliferated is because university ranking agencies rely on them too. Does all this sound strange to you? It should. Only an army of bureaucrats armed with PhDs could have devised systems that literally judge a book or an article by its cover, the very definition of anti-intellectualism. Defenders of this kind of appraisal system will tell you it's rational because it relies on the fact that top-tier journals and book publishers tend to have more stringent peer review processes and lower acceptance rates. But if they're honest, they would also admit that these are merely broad generalizations and that there are always exceptions. Unimpressive work being regularly published in top-tier venues and outstandingly original work that stands the test of time in lower-ranked venues. And there's a good reason for this. Top-tier publishers are the most established, which means that they are the most prone to orthodox thinking. They are bound within their disciplines and may be resistant to paradigm-challenging work, including interdisciplinary work and research from outside of the Western liberal democratic settings that are the traditional milieus for research in many disciplines. Top-ranked journals are American and European, not just in their origins, but also in their geographic focus. So it's not a level playing field, as Jacqueline has mentioned. There is structural discrimination against non-Western work. I should stress, though, that there are many decent peer-reviewed journals, including those based in the West, that are open to non-Western research and through which we can disseminate excellent work about Singapore. The bad news is that the metrics-based appraisal that our universities have voluntarily chosen to adopt is incapable of recognizing excellence that appears in these lower tier but good journals. So while there is no absolute shortage of publication venues for work on Singapore, the tyranny of journal metrics creates a false scarcity. It creates a hierarchy based on perceived status and pressures untenured scholars in particular to write for editors of Western, mainly American, journals, thus reproducing Western dominance of the field. This is less of a problem in disciplines that operate at the individual level of analysis, like psychology, but hurts disciplines where social and political context is everything. For example, if you're studying the effectiveness of health education or marketing messages at the cognitive level by doing experiments in Singapore, your research might have an international market since neurological processes don't differ that much between populations. If, on the other hand, you're studying the dynamics of one-party dominance in Singapore, chances are that you will have to settle for NUS Press if you are writing a book, and maybe articles in lower-tier journals like, say, the Journal of Contemporary Asia. By the way, the dynamics of one-party dominance is, of course, the title of the classic book by Professor Chan Eng Chee, published in 1976. It continues to be a must-read for anyone interested in the subject. But a present-day Chan Eng Chee probably would not be promoted to associate professor or get tenure on the strength of that work. Today's metrics-based performance appraisal systems would judge her based on where her work was published. University of Singapore Press, is that even an elite press? No, according to the NUS, right, which does not consider NUS Press to be sufficiently good, rather than judging the work by its inherent quality. These research assessment systems have resulted in massively distorted incentive structures, pressuring scholars who want or need to advance their careers to turn away from preferred local topics that may be socially relevant for their own societies, and toward interests and priorities of editors in the global north. Since critical scholarship on Singapore is neither valued by their own industry nor by their state, why bother, right? Singaporean academics, not all, but many, shift to safer topics that will be more rewarding to one's career. In effect, there's a kind of virtual brain drain. Even if everyone's body remains at home, one's mind wanders in search of foreign approval. How can we break this cycle? We academics need to challenge head-on the ideology that currently dominates university administrations, the ideology that my colleague in HKBU, Kenneth Paul Tan, has called bibliomeritocracy, the lazy equation of bibliometric proxy measures with scholarly merit. We need to correct the myth that this is the direction in which the best universities in the world are heading. Not true. The very best universities have enough self-confidence to use direct peer review, actually reading the stuff, to assess the performance of faculty, which is why I'm not at all surprised to hear from Jacqueline in Cornell, not a bad university, that she hadn't heard of Q1 journals, because it's not the kind of game that the very best universities play. You read the stuff. Using metrics in lieu of peer review is what wannabe top universities do. Those desperate to climb the rankings but lack self-confidence to make qualitative judgments about peers' work. In fact, there are current movements in global higher education against such crude quantitative performance measures. The San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment and the European Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment have taken strong stands against journal-based metrics such as journal impact factors. Among the signatories of these two agreements are the International Society of Data Science and Analytics, the American Association for Anatomy, the American Mathematical Society, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, the European Chemical Society, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. They've come on board pushing back against these quantitative journal measurements and university rankings, not primarily to promote global diversity, but to promote good science, because they've seen the corrupting influence of metrics on the quality of scientific research. It's ironic that even as administrators in the social sciences claim that journal impact factors promote scientific rigor, hardcore scientists are abandoning such metrics as fundamentally flawed. If academia, that is us, if we can fix these self-inflicted problems, we'll be much better able to serve the public. Impactful local scholarship will be then backed by supportive professional incentives. If that happens, then we'll only need to worry about externally imposed political constraints and censorship. What a relief! Thank you. So.